we will follow.
Hello and welcome to Trinity Talk Live, water cooler conversation from a Christian perspective. I am Ken Coughlin. Thank you very much for joining us again this week. We've got a really good and very important episode for you this week. But before we get into that, I want to make a quick advertisement, a word from our sponsor, so to speak. We have a very limited budget, and we're trying to bring this, constantly move this program forward, and as well as the other video programs that we have here for you on the Trinity Joppa channel. And so what we started doing is we're trying to take some measures to make it more self-sufficient. And the first step in that is we are selling, by popular demand, our lovely Trinity Talk Live mugs. I'm being told to move it this way. This way? We good? That good? Our lovely Trinity Talk Live mugs. Actually, we've had these in the show for a few months now, and people actually, every time they see them, say, oh, I'd love to get one of those. So now we said, okay, well, now you can. If you'd like a mug, they're $13 a piece. If you're here local to the Joppa, Maryland area, then you can pick them up after any worship service at the Welcome Center here. If you're not, then it is $8 shipping and handling. And the way you get one of these lovely mugs, if you'd like one, is by shooting me an email at kcoughlin@trinityjoppa.org. Let us know that you want a mug, how many mugs, what your name is, how many mugs you want, and if you need shipping or not, and if you do need shipping, what the shipping address is going to be. And then you send a check to us here, made out to Trinity Joppa, to Trinity Lutheran Church, and you can mail that check to the address on the screen. Make absolutely sure you put mugs in, or TTL mugs in the memo line of that check. Otherwise, our lovely treasurer, Don Wagner, is going to think you're just making a donation to the church. He's going to put it into our regular weekly offering, which if you want to make addition to, add to the weekly offering, that's great too, but you won't get your mugs. So put that in there so she knows that it actually is money for the mugs. All right? We really appreciate your help. And so now, with that out of the way, we are going to go ahead and get started. And I am going to turn to our guest today. And in a kind of a new tradition we have here on Trinity Talk Live, rather than people hearing me talk forever, I'm asking our guests to introduce themselves. So why don't we start right over here to my right? It's a familiar face. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Perfect. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm Dr. Kendra O'Hora. I am a co-founder and owner of Harco MFT and Wellness Center. It's a new business venture that I just started with my colleague Meredith. She was on the show a couple months ago when we talked about depression and anxiety. So the business serves couples, families, individuals. We work with trauma, marriages, through divorces, all those different life transitions. And so feel free to check out the website at harcomft.com.
And we're going to have a link to that in the show notes as well. So
Thanks.
Thank you very much
Thanks
for coming
having
back.
me. Thanks for having me.
And who's this gentleman all the way down here in the end?
My name is Bill.Rehrig. I've been a member of Trinity since 1970. And I got involved with Stephen Ministry when it first started here in 1993. And in 1998, I became director of Stephen Ministry, and that's a position I still retain. Currently, we have 42 Stephen ministers visiting with people who have challenges, problems, and other kinds of situations in their lives which need support and help from people who have been trained to give a Christian perspective in dealing with these bumps in the road of their lives.
So I want to start there for a second, because a lot of people might not be familiar with the term.
Okay.
What exactly is Stephen Ministry, and what do they provide?
Stephen Ministry is a program which trains lay people to use their already God-given gifts and talents to support people with problems, with challenges, with physical and other kinds of things that blindside them. We work with people who are dying. We work with people who have grief because someone has died. We work with people with job problems, with just anything that is not okay in their lives.
And I guess we'll talk more about it, as we go through, but I wanted to kind of get that out of the way from the get-go. And so I don't forget, if someone does need a Stephen minister, and they're local here to the Joppa, Maryland area, how do they go about getting one?
They can email me at William.Rehrig, R-E-H-R-I-G, at yahoo.com.
All right,
And then I'll get in touch. We'll
put that on the screen. We'll put that one in the show notes as well.
Fine. Thank you.
So the topic of the week this week is dealing with grief. We've had, this is one that we've gotten some feedback. When we did the depression and anxiety episode, we got a lot of positive feedback from that. More so than just people saying, oh, that was a good episode. We actually had several people actually reach out to us and say, thank you for doing that episode. And of course, it seems sometimes the very next thing out of their mouth was, thank you for doing that episode. Now can you do one on grief? And so we wanted to kind of provide that here. And so I want to start out by talking a little bit generally, and then we'll kind of get specific into, what people can do. But what should people expect when hard times come, when they're dealing with grief? What are the typical, I don't know if symptoms is the right word, this isn't my area of expertise, but what kind of things are normal, so to speak, for them to be going through?
Mm-hmm. The most common way that we like to talk about grief is to describe anything as normal. So the idea of normal can kind of be thrown out the window.
Told you I wasn't an expert.
Because really anything is normal. A lot of times people will experience extreme sadness, confusion, pain. You might see that manifest in that they don't want to get out of bed, or they're angry, or they're bitter. Those are all normal, common symptoms. Sometimes you see people increase their drug or alcohol abuse. That's just a way that they're coping. Obviously, that's not really the healthiest, avenue for coping, but people still do that when they're in that shock phase and the denial of loss and grief.
There's a cultural problem with grief in that we are taught not to show our emotions in public. Mm. And so after the mourning period is over and you go back to work or back to your regular activities, the tendency is to act like everything is okay, mm-hmm. and there's no problem, when inside the person is grieving deeply. Mm-hmm. And that can be very devastating, because one of the problems with grief is that some people at times tend to deny the grief, mm-hmm. because it's something that really hurts and they don't want to face it because it does hurt. So they bury it and pretend that the house isn't burning. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I think is really an antidote to that is for the grieving person to get connected with somebody that they trust and know, and really spend time with them and have them help them through this as a support system. And a lot of times this is not somebody in the family, because I don't want to burden the family. They're grieving too, so I don't want to bother them. So that's where a person like a Stephen minister or a trusted friend can come in, because that kind of relationship, there's no problem with sharing their thoughts because they're not burdening them. Mm-hmm. And it's an okay situation because that friend and all that is supporting them, and it's okay. There's no judgment. There's no real downside to that relationship in that regard.
You mentioned, do you mind if I add
No, go
something?
ahead, please.
You mentioned that the denial part of it, and that brought up the kind of the stages or the phases of grief that we often hear about. And I like to add the caveat that the traditional model was that those stages were linear, that you experience one and then you experience the other. But what we most commonly see is that people can experience denial, shock, anger, bargaining all at the same time. They can jump stages back, they can skip stages forward. That's really common.
That's true. When my mother died, she died after a 6 months battle with terrible cancer. And when she finally passed, I was out of school a week. And as I was driving to school the day I went back, I realized I wasn't grieving anymore. And I really berated myself because that was not a good son who only grieved for a week. But then I started thinking back, and I found that I started the grieving process before she died, as I saw the progression towards the passing come.
Which is such a good point, because that's called anticipated grief. It's actually something that's talked quite about a bit in the literature, is this idea that especially with Alzheimer's, with dementia, with cancer, that you start to grieve far beyond and before when the person actually is passed.
What are some of those things you were talking about? You mentioned the different stages that can come. They're not linear. They can come in any kind of order. But what are they? I mean, you mentioned some kind of in passing, but what does bargaining mean, for example? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, so the idea of bargaining is that the person starts to, kind of plead with God, like bring this person back, or give them some chance of hope, or I'll do this if I can get this back. And it can manifest in a lot of ways before the person dies and then after. Do you have other thoughts to that?
The thing that strikes me as I've worked with people that are grieving is that acceptance is the goal. Mm-hmm. And until the person reaches that goal, this kind of bargaining continues in some form. And with everybody, it's a different length of time. My stepmother lost my father 12 years ago, and she has yet to accept it. Mm. And that's because she has not yet come to the acceptance.
How do you know? I guess here's an interesting question. If there's no normal grieving process, if there's no normal or standard time period, no normal order to the stages, things like that, how do you know when you would recommend maybe moving beyond even a Stephen minister or a friend and that they need to get some kind of professional counseling?
That's a situation that this trusted friend can assist in determining. I don't know that there are many people who would, in grieving by themselves, say, I need help. Because many times we ask people if they would like to have one of us work with them, and there's a denial. They just don't think that they need help. They can do it on their own. They're strong, especially men. Especially men. Which leads to another point. Stephen Ministry is a nationally produced program for churches. And they've got a bunch of publications, one of which is a series of 4 booklets about grieving. And they go through stages in time periods. The first of the 4 books is to be handed to the person in 3 weeks after the passing. The next 3 months, the next 6 months, and the next 12 months. And each of those covers the kinds of things the typical person would be experiencing at those points, because a year later, I don't think anybody is totally over it yet. It's just way too soon. Mm-hmm. And the other thing about that is that impacts the decision-making process. You know, if somebody dies and 6 months later you, the spouse that's alive, decides to sell your house, that's too soon to make that decision.
I was actually going to add, that's one of the questions I had here I wanted to cover today. I'm glad you mentioned it, is what advice do you guys have for people who are going through this grieving process as far as what might be termed major life decisions, what qualifies as a major life decision, and are things that you should kind of hold off on and say, no, don't do that just yet. Mm-hmm. You know?
Yeah, so to jump back to the other question real quick, I had an idea is that when someone's grief starts to kind of seep into other realms of their life and create dysfunction is when I would say that they need to start reaching out to a therapist or someone that they could trust. And as you suggested, that often that self-awareness for, internally doesn't come right away. And so maybe that's the role of a family member or friend to let them know, hey, I'm noticing that, for example, drug and alcohol abuse is impacting your ability to go to work or to take care of your children or things like that. As far as, what are those major life decisions? This is actually something you see quite a bit, that people lose a spouse and then they get married, or that they buy a house or they want to relocate, or lots of those big life transitions can happen, and then the person doesn't know, is this culturally appropriate, right? Socially, is it okay for me to be making these types of choices soon after the loss of someone?
Right. And there are also stages of grief, different kinds. For example, the obvious one is loss of a spouse or a child or someone like that. But the other grief styles are, you lose your job, you get fired immediately. Mm-hmm. Your house burns down. You learn that you've got a condition which limits your mobility and you are a mobile person in your job. Those kinds of griefs are different, and they're very much unattended to. Because, John lost his job. Gee, I hope he finds another one, and that's the end of the conversation.
Yeah, I was going to add to that I really appreciate that point, because I see that a lot in my clinical practice, that I talk about grief with people, that divorce is a form of grief. Even having a child with a limitation or a disability, I know so many parents who they believe that's their calling, they care for that child so well, which is a beautiful thing, but they also have to grieve that that child might not ever launch from the home, might not ever go to college or get married. So you're exactly right that those other types of griefs aren't often attended to, even though they look a lot like grief in the form of loss and through death.
I can imagine that's got to be a particularly difficult one to deal with something like that, because that's, I guess if you're dealing with the loss of a loved one, the loved one's not coming back, and so eventually there's, I don't know if it would be easier to get to a point where you're moving on, as opposed to a situation with the child you're talking about, where that child is still with you and it's always there and it's always a constant reminder. Is there anything different that you would handle in those two situations?
Yeah, that's actually another term called complicated grief or compounded grief. So compounded, think of multiple grief or traumas kind of adding up. Complicated is where the external circumstances are less finite. With death, it's done, and then there's the healing process can start, although it looks different for everyone. With those types of circumstances, the complicated part is just that there's more to it. It's not as clean cut.
Sure. The other thing is that one prescription doesn't fit everybody in terms of dealing with and the timeline of the grief process. And this is where relationship with somebody that you really trust comes in, because you need a sounding board that's impartial but supportive to let you know where you are and how you're doing. I mean, the driver who's getting senile doesn't know he's not driving safely. He just remembers how he used to drive, and he figures that that's the way he drives all the time. So a sounding board and a very trusted friend or someone that the church sends over to have a relationship is really important, because otherwise the family can implode around that problem.
Bill, you mentioned earlier that sometimes people try to avoid dealing with grief. What are some of the risks if they do that?
That's a good question.
Well, physical problems. Not eating, being upset in the stomach all the time, emotionally and nervously, stress. There have been cases, not here, where people have actually went and committed suicide because they internalized the grief and didn't deal with it. Also, if you don't deal with the grief, you check out of your life that you had before. Your work becomes terrible, and you miss a lot of days because you just don't feel like going to work. And it's sort of like, I don't like the way his game is being played anymore. I'm going to take my ball and go home.
Yeah. I think that's a good question, because there's so many different ways that this can manifest. One of the things that I see happen a lot is people ignore their responsibilities after loss, and then those responsibilities pile up and they get overwhelmed. And so I think of things that have to get done, like taxes, and we just all went through that just a couple months ago. So in that sense, when those things are ignored, then the person, when they're dealing with their grief, they end up feeling more overwhelmed because those things aren't in place. Another thing that I see is, speaking to the suppression of emotion, is I worked with this really sweet couple where she had lost two parents back to back, and what ended up happening was, through suppressing her own grief, her anger continued to come out in aggression towards her husband. As a result, he kind of distanced from the relationship and ended up having an affair. So they were able to work through that and heal, which was amazing. But at the time, the grief was so extreme that she couldn't understand what she was going through, and it actually put more strain on her marriage. So obviously, when you don't attend to your grief, it can impact your most important relationships.
I hear a lot of this stuff, and I have not. I'll be upfront and honest with you. Unlike the last episode where we were talking about depression and anxiety, and I was telling you that I actually carried those diagnoses myself, and I struggled with that myself. I've still got both my parents. I mean, I have not been one to haven't had to deal with maybe the type of devastating loss that we're talking about here. Part of that's because I was a military brat, so I moved around a lot growing up, and I didn't have a lot of real close friends because I moved every 2 to 3 years. I have a few, but not a lot. But I'm hearing a lot of things that kind of remind me of the last show, like when you're talking about withdrawing and not doing your fulfilling the obligations or things that need to get done. Is there a connection between a lot of what we talked about in the last show when it comes to depression, especially, and dealing with grief?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think one of the challenges from a clinical perspective is that we have these kind of terms or criteria that link up with grief and depression, and it's sometimes frustrating from the clinical end because what's considered normal is a grief period of about a year, but as you cited, that's often not within the realm for most people's grief journey. Anything beyond that is considered, now it's time. If your depression is going on, if you're experiencing these symptoms, you need to do something about it. So I do see a lot of anxiety and depression associated with grief. I don't necessarily deal a lot in my practice with death solely, but those other types of griefs that you talked about. And for example, just yesterday, Mother's Day, I have a lot of friends and family who have lost a child through miscarriage or have lost a parent. Those are forms of grief that maybe are more silent because we're busy celebrating the joy of Mother's Day and not necessarily some of the pains that come along with that.
There's another point, too, and that is this. It's okay to grieve. And all you have to do is go into the Bible and see the story about Lazarus and Jesus grieved at his friend Lazarus' death. He brought him back to life, but he grieved over that death. Culturally, we sometimes get the idea that we can't cry. If we do, we're weak. And therefore, we've got to keep a stiff upper lip. That's more British than American, but it still applies. And you have to accept that, because if you don't grieve, the consequences are not good.
Yeah, I remember someone saying years ago, it was probably a pastor or someone from the church said that there's more psalms of lamentation than there are of joy. And that really stuck out to me, the idea that we need to allow ourselves room to be angry, to weep, to lament over whatever life brings us, that is part of the natural process of connecting with our spirituality as well.
That's true. That's true.
So if you guys had, to kind of wrap things up, if you had someone that has just suffered a loss just now, and they're watching the show, all right, and it's still fresh in their hearts and their minds, what would you tell them right now if they're watching the show? What's the first piece of advice you would give them?
First of all, realize that what is. Take things day to day. Try and remain positive about what is still there. For example, a child who loses a parent has to understand that part of that parent lives on in them. The spouse has a long relationship probably with their passed on spouse. Their memories, their accomplishments, all are still part of their lives. And sure, it hurts when that spouse dies. And sure, there's an emptiness in their lives because of that. But still, life must go on. And really the honest question to be asked within themselves is, what would he or she want me to do at this point?
Yeah, I think my encouragement would be to trust yourself. Whatever it is that you think you need, allow yourself, you know yourself the best, allow yourself to go forward with that process. Crying, normal. Being angry, normal. Wanting to withdraw and not get out of bed, all normal. So I think my biggest encouragement to someone would be just trust yourself, that what you need in this moment is okay.
There's another dimension to that too, and that is about a week or 10 days after the funeral, all the attention that's heaped upon the decedent spouse disappears, and all of a sudden you're alone. And that's an important time for others to get involved with them.
Absolutely.
So let me, last thing, closing off, I'm going to let you make a sales pitch here, Bill. Specifically, I want to shift the focus a little bit because, we do have people, I don't know if you're still, I know we just installed a whole bunch of new Stephen ministers not too long ago, but there could also be people from around the country watching this who might be wondering the kind of the flip side. Okay, hey, I'm hearing them talk about the importance of being there for those that are going through this, and they want to know how to go about becoming a Stephen minister or being that person. How would somebody go about doing that to fill that role?
Stephen Ministry works through churches. And if one attends a church that does not have a Stephen Ministry, the first thing they should do is go onto the Stephen Ministry website. Just Google Stephen Ministry, St. Louis, and that will bring them to the website, and it will give them all the information they need to know about how to get started with their church. Then the pastor has to get involved because there is a budgetary consideration in terms of the beginning of the program. There's some training involved. And then the local church trains their parishioners to work in this regard. And then through the pastor and the other church leaders, people are matched up with those who have needs. And there it goes. I mean, when we started here in 93, we had 8 people as Stephen ministers. Now we got 42, two of which are still waiting. And we may have to train some more next year, depending on our needs. So,
excellent. Well, thank you both very much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having us.
It's good. And if you like this show, do us a favor. Go ahead and click the like button. That's a thumbs up button right here on the YouTube page. Also, if you wouldn't mind, subscribe to our YouTube channel. I don't know where we're at right now. I didn't check. We've kind of made a short-term goal here. We're trying to get up to 300 subscribers. We're getting close. If you haven't subscribed yet and you're watching the show, do us a favor, go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We've got a lot more on here than just Trinity Talk Live. And share this video, share the channel, tell other people about it, that it's out there. When I'm supposed to pitch the mugs again, I'm being told to pitch the mugs again. These are the mugs. Remember, if you want a mug, $13 if you want to pick it up locally. If you need it shipped, we can ship it to you. $8 shipping and handling. K. Coughlin at trinityjoppa.org to let me know you want it. Send the check to, I'll put the address on the screen one more time for the check, and make sure you write TTL mugs in the memo line on that. We do have a Facebook page here on Trinity Talk Live. It's at Trinity Talk Live Podcast. You can give us a like on there. We post a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff on there, a lot of announcements. As a matter of fact, just this past week, we posted a really cool announcement, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. You got to go on the Facebook page if you want to know what it was and search this past week. Let's just say we got permission to do an upcoming episode at a really cool location. We're going to be going on the road in July. That's our plans. We got some things there. I don't know if we're going to fit this episode in July or not. We're still working out the scheduling, but we do have a really cool episode coming up. So give us a like on our Facebook page at Trinity Talk Live Podcast, and you'll be in the know about everything we've got coming up. So next week we have... Oh, we don't have an episode next week. Yes, we do. Yeah, we do. Next week is What I Wish I Knew Before I Went to College. That is actually, believe it or not, our season finale. That is the last episode in our first season. We have been on the air for almost a year now. We're coming up on our 1-year anniversary, and we have a real special episode coming up planned. There's no episode on Memorial Day weekend, but then the first Tuesday in June, we have a special 1-year anniversary episode where we're having a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff. We're taking a look back at the past year and seeing how far we've come. And we're going to have, like I said, a lot of behind-the-scenes and see everything that goes into making an episode like this. It's going to be a really cool, really fun episode. So make sure you tune in for that. That's going to be Tuesday, June 5th. I want to say it's June 5th at 12 noon is when that goes up on the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel. So let me one more time thank Dr. Kendra O'Hara for coming back. We must have done something right. You came back a second time. I really do mean it. We got so much positive feedback the last time you were on you were a blessing to us, and I really appreciate you coming back. We're going to have to get Meredith Mertens back on again now too. And thank you, Bill.Rehrig.
You're quite welcome.
Bill, and I'll mention this. Bill and I have worked together for several years now. I don't know. Yes. We're both on the PR evangelism team, and so he's been part of the team that's actually helped make this what it is. So I want to thank you for that, and remind me to thank the rest of the team at our meeting tomorrow night.
I'll try and do that. Actually, it's tonight.
Oh, it is tonight. Actually, no, it was last night because this airs on Tuesday. So I already thanked them. Yeah, that's it. So
did you have much trouble with your dates before you were married?
Yes, I did. I always do. Anybody that watches this show often enough knows that I gave up trying to pretend and have any illusions like on episode 5 or something like that because I couldn't keep it straight. So I've been upfront from the get-go that these things are not. It's called Trinity Talk Live. They're not done live. I didn't name the show, but I think the impetus of it was because our newsletter, our printed newsletter that goes out every month is called Trinity Talk. And so we wanted some way to distinguish this from that, and the idea was, well, this is the one with live people. So there you go. That's why it's called Trinity Talk Live. We're here. We're live. Yes. That's why it's called Trinity Talk Live, but it is not actually live in the film sense. We do film these things usually on Mondays, occasionally on Sundays, but so that messes with me a few times here and there when I say things that I shouldn't say. What's that?
Sometimes weeks in advance.
Sometimes weeks in advance. Like, yeah, I got news for this special episode we got coming up for the 1-year anniversary. We've been working on that for several months now. Yeah, so that's going to be a good one. All right, thank you again one last time for coming back on, and thank you everybody out there for tuning in. Make sure you tune in next week, and God bless.
In your word we will follow.